years. My first visit to Monte Carlo for the Grand Prix. To begin with, we looked at Prince Rainier's palace on the cliff high above the port. The principality nestles in a bowl of the Alpes Maritimes in the south of France and has hosted the archetypal street race since 1929, when its first winner was the Briton, Williams, who won for Bugatti. So Bugatti won in 29, 1930 and 1931, and Nuvolari won for Alfa Romeo in 1932. In 1933, Varzi in his Bugatti took the honours, where Alfa were back the next year with a 1-2 for Moll and Schill. The three races before the last war all fell to Mercedes-Benz, as the might of the Nazi-backed empire expressed itself on the racetracks. The winners were Fagioli, Caracciola, and in 1937, Manfred von Brauchitsch. The first post-war race was in 1948, when Nino Farina won for Maserati. There was no race in 1949, but by 1950 the Monaco Grand Prix was part of the new World Championship. Fangio had given Alfa its third victory at the circuit, ahead of Ascari and Chiron in Ferrari and Maserati. 5 years passed before there was another Monaco Grand Prix, when Maurice Trintignant had won for Ferrari. And then last year, 1956, Moss had won by just 6 seconds in the Works Maserati, ahead of a Lancia Ferrari, which Fangio had taken over from Collins, having crashed his own car. This year, 1957, BRM were taking part in their first Continental GP. Cooper were using Climax engine Formula 2 cars, one of 1.5 litres and the other stretched to 2 litres. Maserati were mostly relying on the 6-cylinder 250Fs, but one was fitted with the new V12 engine. Horace Gould had brought along his private standard 250F. Jean Bera had not recovered from injuries received while practicing for the Mille Miglia, so the 4th place in the Maserati team had to be fought over by Scarlatti or Menditegai. Ferrari's drivers were to be Mike Hawthorn, Peter Collins and Maurice Trintignant. Still using the Lancia V8 engine, these cars have now lost their pannier tanks, and one of the three had new Ferrari suspension as well. The V8 is fitted into these cars at an angle, so that the prop shaft runs down the side of the car alongside the driver, thus allowing a lower seating position than, for example, the van wall, where the driver sits above the gearbox itself. We took a look at the circuit from the courtyard in front of the presidential palace. The final section of each lap is run round the harbour, the trees to the left of the road hiding the pits. At the end, and directly underneath us here, the gasworks hairpin, where the cars return past the other side of the trees. Just beyond the hairpin is the start-finish line, and then it's uphill to the right-hander at Saint-Devote. Uphill further along the viaduct, and then left into Casino Square. The road leads downhill from the casino to another hairpin by the station. This left-hander leads into a very short straight before a hairpin right at Mirabeau. A 90 right onto the seafront leads to the famous tunnel, and after the tunnel, the cars plunge downhill towards the harbour through a left-right chicane. Then it's down a ramp almost to sea level, with a tricky left-hander at Tabac and onto the pit straight to complete the lap. 10 corners to the lap, 100 laps to the race. so it's called the race of 1,000 corners. Sterling Moss had walked down to investigate Tabac Corner, just before the red cars of Italy were wheeled out for the final practice session on Saturday afternoon. Moss had already won £100 for the fastest practice lap in the first session on Thursday morning, so first round to Vanwall. Then on Friday, Fangio had been quickest with a 1 minute 42.7 seconds, 6/10 quicker than Moss. Vanwall won, Ferrari won. Maurice Trintignant was 6th fastest in his Ferrari. Cooper were down to 1 car, Jack Brabham having crashed his on Friday. His 2-litre Climax engine had been transferred to the other Cooper to be run by Rob Walker's team. Before practice could start, the streets at Monaco always have to be cleared of ordinary traffic. BRM had been struggling with poor handling, bad brakes, and a lack of power. Times were important because only 16 of the 20 entries are ever allowed to start the race at Monaco. The 4th Ferrari driver was the German Taffy von Trips on his first visit to the Monaco circuit. Connaught had managed one more race entry with a new high-tail design for the B series. They were relying on the young Stuart Lewis-Evans and Ivor Bueb. They had a 3rd car as a spare. Connaught had fitted truncated noses, the better to cope with the inevitable shunting matches that always go on in the early laps at Monaco. Moss and Hawthorn were, as always, the prey of the photographers. Moss then tried on one of the Ferraris for size. Hawthorn had to show him where the pedals were. At last, practice got underway in front of packed grandstands. Hawthorn was soon out in action, followed by Moss in the Vanwall. Lewis-Evans was next away in the Connaught. As one of the BRMs came in for adjustment, the V12 Maserati flashed past, but it was obviously a real handful with no low-down power, which is so necessary on this circuit. Quick time calculations in the Connaught pit showed that both cars were struggling to qualify, particularly Bueb. As Moss and Hawthorn battled for fastest time of the day, Collins went out in Hawthorn's car and promptly crashed it into the harbour wall, writing off the front end of the car. Collins was shaken but unhurt. Hawthorn, obviously miffed at the loss of his own car, went out in the spare and ran quicker than he had in his original. There are some wonderful viewing positions at Monaco. Bueb was 16th fastest, but his start in the race still had to be fought for. Hawthorn was lapping in the T car, still equipped with its side tanks. There was traffic at the gasworks hairpin, with Fangio now in the V12 Maserati, ahead of Salvadori's BRM, one of the Privateer 250Fs, and Harry Schell. Fangio was certainly taming the V12, but not able to improve on his 6-cylinder engined pole position time. Hawthorn did 1 minute 45 in the hack car, a time later equalled by Moss, but neither could approach Fangio's remarkable 1:42.3 of Friday afternoon. So we had Fangio on pole, with Collins and Moss alongside him. On row 2, Hawthorn's Ferrari and Brooks's Vanwall. Behind them in the 3-2-3 formation are Trantignon's Ferrari and the Maseratis of Menditegai and Shell. In row 4, lined up Von Trips's Ferrari and Maston Gregory's private Maserati. Next came Flockhart in the only BRM to qualify, Horace Gould and Lewis Evans in the fastest Connaught. Behind them in row 6, Scarlatti and Brabham, and the last to qualify, Ivor Bueb, alone on the back row in the second team Connaught. At least both Connaughts were in the race, which is just as well because, although it wasn't known then, this was to be the little Connaught team's last Grand Prix, forced out finally by the expense of it all. By contrast, Vanwall's success lay before them, and here they had 2 cars in the top 4 on the grid. But with all their resources, Ferrari were going to take some beating in this race. The one remaining Cooper lay alongside the solitary BRM. The crowd impatiently await the arrival of Prince Rainier and his beautiful American bride, Princess Grace. Fangio, for once, was on hand and ready in good time. With his win in the Argentine Grand Prix under his belt, he was already lining himself up for his 5th World Championship. Prince Rainier's car approached. And with the royal couple in place in their special box, it was time for the race to begin. The sun was shining now, but there had been heavy rain overnight. And a last-minute hitch for Moss, whose Vanwall has to be push-started. At last they were away, with Moss bounding into the lead. On the run behind the pits, Moss and Fangio were neck and neck as they rushed up to Saint-Devote. As they came through Tabac for the first time, Moss had a 2-car lengths lead over Fangio. And by the end of lap 1, the order was Moss, Fangio, Collins, Shell, Brooks, Menditegai, Hawthorn, Von Trips, and the rest of the pack. On the run up the hill from Saint-Devote on the second lap, Collins got past Fangio to take over second place. Then Moss lost it coming out of the tunnel. Collins crashed too, avoiding the debris, and he collected Hawthorn. So that was 3 British drivers out on lap 4. And Fangio was left, leading Brooks in his Vanwall. The excitement appeared to have gone, because no one could see how young Tony Brooks would challenge the world champion on this tight circuit. Behind them in third lay Von Trips, ahead of Menditegai and Shell. The connaught mechanics looked anxiously up the road to Tabac. Bueb's fuel tank had split and he was leaking petrol over the circuit. Lewis Evans was doing fine in 8th place. Bueb arrived for repairs. The exhaust pipe had fallen off as well. The sun was shining now, but there had been heavy rain overnight. And a last-minute hitch for Moss, whose van wall has to be push-started. At last they were away, with Moss bounding into the lead. On the run behind the pits, Moss and Fangio were neck and neck as they rushed up to Saint-Devote. As they came through Tabac for the first time, Moss had a 2-car lengths lead over Fangio. And by the end of lap 1, the order was Moss, Fangio, Collins, Schell, Brooks, Menditegai, Hawthorn, Von Trips, and the rest of the pack. On the run up the hill from Saint-Devote on the second lap, Collins got past Fangio to take over second place. Then Moss lost it coming out of the tunnel. Collins crashed too, avoiding the debris, and he collected Hawthorn. So that was 3 British drivers out on lap 4. And Fangio was left, leading Brooks in his van wall. The excitement appeared to have gone, because no one could see how young Tony Brooks would challenge the world champion on this tight circuit. Behind them in third lay Von Trips, ahead of Menditegai and Schell. The connaught mechanics looked anxiously up the road to Tabac. Bueb's fuel tank had split and he was leaking petrol over the circuit. Lewis Evans was doing fine in 8th place. Bueb arrived for repairs. The exhaust pipe had fallen off as well. Mike Hawthorn had walked back and was discussing the accident with his compatriots. The crumpled nose on Trintignant's car bears witness to the usual Monaco dodge-em-car tactics. Then Schell crawled along the pit row with broken front suspension. Fangio was not just touring, because Brooks was holding station about 15 seconds behind him. Lewis Evans was now up to 7th. Trintignant had pitted to cure a misfire, during which time his car's nose had been straightened somewhat. Fangio was lapping the back markers as Bueb, now back in the race, ran last, many laps behind after his long pit stop. The only man who really appeared to be racing at this stage was Jack Brabham in the little Cooper, lying 4th ahead of Menditegai. Hawthorn returned to the race for a few laps, having taken over Von Trips's car, but the tall Englishman was too cramped in the cockpit to be able to continue. So the race, which had promised so much, developed into a war of attrition. Only Brabham entertained the crowd in the little Cooper. Brooks continued to hold station behind Fangio, maintaining the gap at around 40 to 48 seconds. Fangio was lapping steadily at around 1 minute 50 seconds, some 7 seconds slower than the best his car was able to do. So he was obviously under-stressed and unlikely to break. Brooks had clearly settled for second place in his Vanwall, eager to give the British team its best result yet. Fangio remained as cool as ever in the Maserati. No one would dare challenge the master. Trintignant was still circulating in his battered and ailing Ferrari, but only Bueb was still behind him. Flockhart, still running in the BRM, followed Bueb round gasworks. With only 10 cars left running, seeing 4 all at once raised a little excitement. Then Flockhart was the next to go when his engine blew on lap 60. There was no stopping Fangio, and with 10 laps to go, the order read Fangio, Collins, Von Trips, Brabham. Harry Schell had been losing oil for some time from his Maserati and finally had to call it a day. His departure meant there were now just 8 runners. Bueb was at pains to describe the race circuit to his team. His fuel tank had started to leak again, and they were down now to just 7 runners. Next to go was Von Trips, who on the 96th lap had the misfortune to have his engine blow to pieces in the casino square. He spectacularly spun on his own oil and demolished a wall. Now there were 6. Brabham was going to finish an incredible third for Cooper, it seemed. Lewis Evans was 5th in the sole surviving Connaught. So, as Fangio and Brooks dropped down towards the harbour to start their last lap, Brabham's overworked engine suddenly cut out in Casino Square. He coasted down to the seafront and started pushing. Fangio passed Lewis Evans as he started lap 105, and then it was over. Fangio had won his 22nd World Championship Grand Prix victory. Brooks had closed to within 28 seconds at the end, with Mast and Gregory 2 whole laps down in 3rd. The welcome for Brooks was understandably ecstatic. He'd finally shown that a Vanwall could last the distance of an entire international Grand Prix. Brooks's overalls bore evidence of over 3 hours, 10 minutes at the wheel. And then came the plucky Brabham. During his long push back to the pits, he had been passed by Gregory, Lewis Evans, and Trintignant, but he still claimed 6th place. Lewis Evans had given Connaught a 4th place finish on their very last Grand Prix. Fangio received the crowd's applause. He was not to know, but the great Scuderia Maserati had only 2 more wins to come. Surrounded by a lot of greenery, Fangio was able to reflect on a massive points lead in the championship after just 2 events.